Can you believe it's already been 15 years, sweetheart? I asked, my voice light, raising my glass of wine towards Sophie across the table. Her smile flickered quick force, but I caught it. Yes, it's flown by, hasn't it? She replied, glancing down at her plate for a moment before lifting her glass to meet mine. The anniversary dinner was in full swing. Our closest friends, family, everyone important to us had gathered in our home to celebrate the milestone. The dining room was bathed in soft, warm lighting and the hum of conversation filled the air. The candles on the table flickered gently, casting a golden hue over the evening, creating the perfect atmosphere for what should have been a romantic and memorable night. But something felt off. Sophie's smile had always been one of the things I loved about her, but tonight it seemed hollow. She wasn't the lively, bubbly woman I'd fallen in love with, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't fully present. Like her mind was somewhere else. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, hosting a large gathering could be stressful. She had spent the entire day preparing, making sure everything was perfect. Maybe she was just exhausted. As I reached out to grab her hand, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I just need to go freshen up. She muttered, her voice quick, eyes darting around before avoiding mine. I nodded, although my brow furrowed slightly. All right, love, take your time. My voice was casual, though my curiosity was piqued. She turned and walked away from the table, her pace quicker than usual. I watched her disappear down the hallway toward the staircase. Just as I was about to turn back to the conversation with the guests, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Connor, my younger brother, also standing up. I'll be right back.man.conor said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, but the gesture felt off. It lacked warmth. Like the brotherly affection was missing. I turned toward him. But before I could say anything, he had already stepped away from the table, his tall frame moving swiftly in the same direction. Sophie had gone. A small alarm bell rang in my mind, but I quickly balanced it. There was no reason to suspect anything. After all, Sophie and I had been together for a decade and I trusted her, and Connor was family. Maybe he was just going to check on her, see if she needed help. That's all. I was right. I tried to turn my focus back to our guests, engaging in conversation with my best friend, Nolan. He was halfway through a story about his latest business deal, when my mind drifted again. I couldn't stop thinking about how odd both Sophie and Connor had been acting all night. The laughter around the table felt distant. The words from my friends blurred. I turned my head toward the hallway again, expecting to see Sophie return. But minutes passed and she didn't come back. Neither did Connor. A knot tightened in my stomach. A nagging feeling I couldn't ignore any longer. The moment Sophie and Connor disappeared up the stairs, my mind began racing. I tried to ignore it, pushing the uneasy feeling aside, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. As the laughter and chatter of our guests buzzed around me, it felt distant, irrelevant. My eyes stayed fixed on the empty hallway, where they had gone. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath growing shallow. I didn't want to believe the thoughts swirling in my mind, but I couldn't help myself. I excused myself from the table, mumbling something to Nolan, who barely registered my words. The others didn't seem to notice me leaving either. I made my way toward the stairs, moving quietly. My body tense with dread. The house was large, with wide staircases that creaked slightly. If you weren't careful, I took my time, each step slow, and measured halfway up. I paused, straining to hear any sign of Sophie or Connor. The faint murmur of voices reached my ears. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was intimate. It was as if someone had dropped a weight into the pit of my stomach. I continued up, my footsteps lighter, cautious. I approached the master bedroom, the door slightly ajar. Just enough to let their voices leak out into the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, listening. Are you sure about this? It was Sophie's voice. Soft, hesitant. You always say that, came Connor's response. His voice low, confident. But look where you are, on your knees, ready and waiting. Face it, Sophie, you can't resist. There was a soft laugh from Sophie, one that sent a chill down my spine. A laugh I had heard countless times before, but this time it felt like a knife twisting inside me. My mind went blank for a moment, refusing to believe what was happening. I pressed my ear closer to the door, trying to hold on to the thin shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, I was misunderstanding, but then I heard it. You're tense. I heard him say, his voice barely audible. Shut up, Connor. Sophie replied, her voice sounding different, less nervous, more intimate. You always say that. Connor's voice came again, followed by a low chuckle. But look where you are. You can't resist, can you? The unmistakable sound of them together. The sounds of movement, the kind of intimate noises that made it impossible to deny what was going on behind that door. My heart pounded so hard. I thought it would burst. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. The woman I had spent 15 years of my life with, the brother I had grown up with, betraying me together. A part of me wanted to burst into the room to confront them both in a rage, but I held back. Something dark and cold settled over me instead. A quiet fury. My hands trembled as I slowly reached for the doorknob, turning it carefully, violently. The door swung open with a soft creak, and the scene before me confirmed everything I had feared. There she was, my wife. Sophie on her knees in front of Connor, her back to me, a bare body exposed. I stood in the doorway, my mouth dry, unable to speak. Connor standing over her. His shirt undone, looked up and met my gaze. His reaction wasn't shock or guilt. It was amusement. He smirked. The same arrogant smirk I had seen 100 times growing up, but now was twisted into something far more sinister. You always leave her starving, don't you? Connor said casually, as if what they were doing was nothing more than a joke between us. Thought I'd give her a real meal. She's done things with me. She's never tried with you. Sophie jerked her head around at his words, her eyes locking onto mine. Her face was a mix of shock and horror, but she didn't move for a moment. She just stared. Frozen like a deer caught in headlights. My heart shattered. For a moment. I felt like I was watching someone else's life, as if this wasn't happening to me, but it was. This was my reality now, and there was no escaping it. I could feel my hands shaking, but strangely, my mind was calm, almost too calm. It was as if all the emotions I should have been feeling, anger, heartbreak, betrayal, were swallowed up by a cold, calculated clarity. I wasn't going to let them see me fall apart. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step into the room, my eyes never leaving theirs. I could see the panic growing in Sophie's eyes, her mouth opening slightly as if she was about to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. Thanks for letting me know. I said, my voice steady. Betraying none of the storm raging inside me. You can keep her. Connor's smirk faltered, and Sophie's eyes widened. Tears already welling up, but I wasn't done yet. I turned my gaze to Connor, locking eyes with him, and delivered the final blow. Oh, and by the way, I said, my tone casual, almost as if we were discussing something trivial. She's pregnant. Congrats on becoming a dad. The color drained from both their faces instantly. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with terror, and Connor took a step back. His smirk completely wiped away. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. What are you talking about? Connor stammered, his voice shaky, the confidence he'd shown moments earlier, completely gone. I'm saying, I continued, my voice cold and detached, that the baby she's carrying isn't mine. It's yours.congratulations.sophie gasped, her hand trembling as it fell to her stomach. Daniel, no, I cut her off with a look. The calm exterior masking the burning anger beneath. Don't get to say anything. Not after this. She opened her mouth to speak again, but I didn't care. I didn't care about her excuses, or her apologies. It was over. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Connor, usually so quick with his words, stood there in stunned silence, his eyes flickering between me and Sophie. I could see the panic in his face. The realization of what he had done starting to sink in, but it was too late. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Sophie and Connor, their pale faces frozen in the dim light of the bedroom. Then, without another glance, I turned and made my way down the stairs. Each step felt deliberate, as though my body were moving through a fog of controlled rage. My mind wasn't on fire. No, it was cold, calculated. My anger wasn't going to explode in some wild confrontation. This was going to be much worse. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses floated through the hallway. As I neared the living room, the party was still going strong, completely oblivious to the betrayal, unraveling just the floor above. I paused for a moment at the foot of the stairs. Took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The crowd barely noticed me at first. No one, and a few others, were chatting near the fireplace, while some of Sophie's friends were gathered around the buffet table, sipping on wine. The entire scene felt like a cruel joke. The night had been meant to celebrate a decade of love and commitment, but now it was all about to fall apart. and I was going to make sure everyone knew. I picked up my wine glass from the table and walked to the center of the room. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face composed, my movements steady. I reached into my pocket and grabbed a spoon, clinking it against the rim of the glass with a sharp ring. The sound cut through the room, financing the conversations and drawing all eyes toward me. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice calm and steady. Thank you all for joining us tonight. A few polite nods and smiles were exchanged, but I could already see the confusion beginning to spread through the crowd. I took a deep breath. Feeling the weight of what I was about to do. But there was no hesitation. I was far beyond that. Now, this evening was supposed to be a celebration of my marriage to Sophie. 10 years together, a decade of commitment, loyalty and love. I paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. I could see Sophie's friends smiling, some of them raising their glasses, as if they expected a heartfelt toast. But I wasn't finished. However, I continued, my voice hardening. I've just discovered that my wife Sophie, I glanced toward the stairs, then back at the crowd, and my brother Connor have been having an affair. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed around the room, followed by a low murmur of disbelief. People exchanged shocked glances, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Some of Sophie's friends turned toward the stairs, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. I stood there watching the chaos I had unleashed ripple through the room, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. But the moment wasn't over yet. As if on cue, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning my head slightly, I saw Sophie and Connor stumbling down the stairs. Their faces pale, their movements frantic. Sophie's eyes were wide with panic, her face flushed with desperation. She pushed past a few guests, her hands trembling as she reached out toward me. Daniel, please let me explain. Her voice was shaky, breaking at the edges. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the woman I had once loved, the woman I had spent a decade building a life with. But the image shattered as soon as I remembered what I had seen upstairs. Any compassion I might have had was long gone. I raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. There's nothing to explain. I said coldly. You've said enough. I'm done. Connor, who had been standing awkwardly at the foot of the stairs, opened his mouth as if to speak. But I cut him off with a sharp glance. He had no right to say anything. No excuses. No apologies. Would change what they had done. You're both dead to me. I said, my voice low, but filled with finality. I saw Sophie flinch at the words, her face crumbling as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. She looked around at the crowd, her friends, our family, everyone staring at her in shock and judgment. Connor stood stiffly beside her. His usual cocky demeanor completely stripped away. He looked like a man who had finally realized the consequences of his actions. For a brief moment, the room was dead.science.no moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire house had been plunged into a cold and forgiving void. Then the whisper started again, louder. This time people were pointing, murmuring in disbelief. I could hear snippets of conversations. I can't believe it. His own brother. How could they? The betrayal wasn't just mine anymore. It was laid bare for everyone to see. Sophie's friends gathered around her, some trying to comfort her, others staring in disbelief. But it didn't matter. Whatever explanations or excuses she might try to give, the damage was done. There was no coming back from this. Connor, on the other hand, had retreated toward the back of the room, keeping his distance. He knew he had lost everything. In that moment, his family, his reputation. As I looked at him, I could see the guilt and shame etched across his face, but I didn't feel an ounce of pity. He had made his choice. I didn't wait for them to say anything else. I turned my back on them, on the entire party, and walked toward the front door. As I reached for the handle, I could hear Sophie sobbing behind me, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. Daniel, please don't leave like this. Please. I'll do anything. Just don't go. I paused for a split second. My hand gripping the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. I didn't know her anything anymore. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone. I barely recognized the life we had built together. The trust, the memories. It was all shattered without another word. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool night air. The sounds of the party, the whispers, and Sophie's desperate cries faded behind me as the door clicked shut. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the silence, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. The chapter of my life with Sophie and Connor was finished. They could have each other, but they would have to live with the consequences of what they had done. As for me, I had made my peace. And from this moment on, I was free. The morning after the public exposure, I contacted my lawyer. I wanted to move fast to rid myself of Sophie and the entire mess as quickly as possible. The memory of her and Connor in the bedroom haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I couldn't let myself stay in that limbo of betrayal for any longer than necessary. The paperwork for the divorce was filed within days, citing infidelity. As the reason Sophie had no leg to stand on legally, and I intended to make this as quick and as brutal as possible. When she received the papers, she called me immediately. Daniel, wait, don't do this. Her voice was shaky. Her words, rush. We can work through this. Please don't give up on us. But I had already given up. I sat there listening to her, the phone cold against my ear, not feeling a shred of sympathy. The woman begging on the other end wasn't the person I had married. That person was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. Sophie. This is over. I said flatly, interrupting her mid-sentence. You made your choice when you decided to betray me with my brother. There was silence on the line for a moment. Followed by soft sobs. I was weak, Daniel. She whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I was thinking. It didn't mean anything. Please don't leave me. I've lost everything. Her words might have moved me once, but not now. Not after everything I had witnessed. You should have thought about that before you betrayed me. I replied, my tone. I see. Now you can live with the consequences. That conversation set the tone for the weeks that followed. Every meeting, every conversation with her was the same. Sophie was desperate, pleading to explain her actions, but it didn't matter. The betrayal was too deep, too final. The divorce proceedings were merciless. Exactly how I wanted them to be. Sophie had been a stay-at-home wife for the past several years. I had supported her entirely, giving her a life of comfort and security, but that was all gone. Now. She had no job, no income, and no means of supporting herself. And I wasn't going to make it easy for her. During one of the meetings at the lawyer's office, Sophie sat across from me, her eyes swollen and red. She hadn't slept that much. Was obvious. Her hands were trembling as she held on to a crumpled tissue, her face pale. She looked like a ghost of the woman she once was. Daniel, she began, her voice breaking. I know you hate me. And I can't blame you for that. But please don't take everything from me. I have nothing left. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. The lawyer's office was quiet. The sound of papers rustling the only noise in the room. I glanced at my lawyer, who was already prepared to move forward with our terms, but I decided to speak first. You're asking me not to take everything from you? I asked, my voice calm, but cold. After you took everything from me. She shook her head frantically, her tears spilling over. I know. I know, but it didn't mean anything. I was confused. And it was a mistake. Please, I'm begging you. My patience was wearing thin. Sophie, this isn't just a mistake. This was a choice. You chose to betray me with my own brother. And now you're carrying his child. Do you understand how deep that cuts? You think you deserve sympathy after everything you've done? Her sobs grew louder and she buried her face in her hands. But I wasn't going to let her emotion manipulate me. Not this time. I turned to my lawyer and nodded, signaling him to proceed with our demands. The house goes to Daniel. My lawyer began, his tone businesslike and detached. As per the prenuptial agreement, Sophie will not receive any spousal support. Additionally, any joint assets, including the car, will be retained by Daniel. Sophie looked up, her face stricken. Wait, no, I can't lose the house. I have nowhere to go. I don't have a job. Daniel. You can't just leave me with nothing. I didn't flinch. You'll figure something out. Maybe Connor can help you out if he sticks around. That is. Her face paled even more at the mention of Connor. They hadn't been seen together since the night of the party. Word had gotten around quickly about the affair, and both of them were social pariahs. Now, from what I'd heard, Connor's girlfriend had left him, and he had lost his job after the scandal. The mess they created had spread far beyond the three of us. But that was Sophie's problem. Now, not mine. As the divorce progressed, Sophie's desperation grew. She called me almost every day, leaving tearful messages, begging for another chance, saying that she couldn't do this on her own. I ignored most of them. It was clear that she was crumbling under the weight of what she had done, and as cold as it might sound, I didn't care. This was her doing, not mine. A few weeks later, during one of our final meetings, Sophie showed up, looking more broken than ever. Her clothes hung loosely on her, and the dark circles under her eyes made it clear that she hadn't been sleeping. She was a shadow of her former self. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. She said quietly as we sat down at the table, but I can't go on like this. I'm losing everything. Daniel, the baby is all I have left. The mention of her pregnancy stirred something in me, but it wasn't sympathy. It was bitterness. The child she carried wasn't mine, and it was a constant reminder of the betrayal. You want me to feel sorry for you because you're having my brother's child. I asked, my voice hard. She flinched, tears brimming in her eyes.again.its. Not like that. I never wanted it to be this way, but it is. I said firmly. And you're going to have to live with it. She sat there, crying softly, her hands resting on her stomach, as if trying to protect the life inside her. But it didn't matter to me. The baby wasn't mine, and neither was she. All I wanted was to get this over with and move on. The divorce was finalized not long after that. Sophie lost everything. The house, the car, the comfortable life she had once taken for granted. She was left with nothing but her pregnancy, a child that wasn't mine, and a future. She had destroyed herself. As I walked out of the courthouse on the day the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange sense of closure. The chapter with Sophie was officially over. And I was free to rebuild my life. Free from the shadow of her betrayal. She had begged for forgiveness, but I had none left to give. She would have to live with the consequences of her choices, just as I had to live with the scars of her betrayal. And as far as I was concerned, that was just as enough. A few months passed after the divorce was finalized, and life began to feel normal again, or at least as normal as it could be. After such a bitter betrayal, I poured myself into work, spent time with friends, and focused on healing the anger and sadness that had consumed me. After finding Sophie and Connor together had started to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. I had moved on, but the past had a way of catching up. Even when you wanted to leave it behind. One afternoon, I received a message from an old friend, Liliana, who had remained in touch with both Sophie and me. After the divorce, the message was short and to the point. Have you heard about Sophie? Call me when you can. I hesitated for a moment before dialing her number. Part of me didn't want to know what had happened. I had washed my hands of Sophie's mess, but something in Liliana's message made me feel like it was serious when she picked up. Her voice was tense. Daniel, I didn't know if I should tell you this. Liliana began, her voice heavy, but I think you should know. Sophie, she lost the baby. For a moment, I didn't respond. My mind tried to process what she had just said. Sophie had lost the baby. The baby that wasn't mine, but the one that had complicated everything. I had no love for that child. It was Connor's, after all. But hearing the news still hit me in a way I didn't expect. I felt a strange mix of emotions. None of them clear. How? I asked. Finally, my voice flat. Liliana sighed, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice. It happened after a fight. She and Connor had a huge argument and things got physical. She fell where he pushed her. I don't know the full details, but she ended up losing the baby. There was a pause as Liliana let the weight of her words sink in. I stood there in silence, staring out the window, my mind racing. Of course, it had come to this. The affair, the betrayal, the divorce. It had all spiraled into chaos. Sophie had thought she could find some kind of happiness with Connor, but now everything was falling apart around her. I'm sorry. Daniel, Liliana said softly. I know this is complicated for you. I just thought you should know. I thanked her for telling me, and ended the call as I sat there. The news of Sophie's miscarriage weighed heavily on my mind. I felt no guilt, no sadness for her or for the unborn child, but I couldn't ignore the tragic irony of it all. Sophie had thrown away her entire life for Connor, and now she had nothing, no marriage, no stability, and not even the child she had conceived with him. A few days later, more details emerged. Connor, as it turned out, hadn't stuck around after the miscarriage. He had fled the country, disappearing without a word to anyone. He left Sophie in ruins, just as he had left behind his family, his career, and any shred of dignity he had once had. It was the perfect ending for him. Really, the man who had seduced my wife and destroyed my marriage had crumbled under the weight of his own selfishness. Word spread that Connor had gone to Europe, likely tried to start over where no one knew about the scandal he had created. I couldn't care less where he ended up in my mind. Connor had ceased to exist. The moment I walked out of my house that night. Now he was nothing but a shadow, a ghost fleeing from the consequences of his actions. As for Sophie, the story was even sadder. She was left alone, broken and completely abandoned. She had no family to turn to. Her parents were gone. And she had alienated herself from most of our friends during the divorce. The few people who had stood by her after the affair had slowly distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the mess that had become her life. Liliana told me that Sophie had moved into a small rundown apartment on the other side of town. She had no job, no real prospects, and now no child. She was truly alone. It was hard to imagine the woman I had once loved, the woman who had been the center of my world for 15 years. Falling so far. One afternoon, I ran into Liliana again, this time at a cafe. We caught up briefly. But as always, the conversation drifted back to Sophie. She's not doing well. Liliana said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I saw her a few days ago. She looks different. She's lost weight. She's pale. It's like she's not really there anymore. The miscarriage hit her hard. And with Connor gone, she's got nothing. I listened, but I didn't respond right away. There was a part of me that wanted to feel pity for Sophie, to acknowledge the pain she must have been going through, but I couldn't muster it. She had made her choices. And these were the consequences. Liliana must have sensed my indifference, because she leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching my face. Do you think you'll ever speak to her again? You know, to get closure. I shook my head. There's nothing left to say. She made her decision. And I made mine. Whatever happens to her now is out of my hands. Liliana nodded, though I could tell she didn't fully agree. I understand. But it's just tragic. You know. It's like she lost everything. And now she's a shell of who she used to be. I didn't respond. I'd already moved on. The person Sophie had become wasn't someone I recognized anymore, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the past. She had Connor. She had the affair, and now she had the consequences. That was the reality of the situation. As I walked back to my car after the conversation with Liliana, I realized just how far removed I had become from the life I once shared with Sophie. I had rebuilt my life, started fresh. And was looking toward the future. But Sophie was stuck in the past, haunted by her own choices and the destruction they had caused. She was paying the price for her betrayal. And it wasn't my job to fix it. The miscarriage, Connor's abandonment, the loss of everything. These were the tragic twists of her own making, and as much as it might sound cruel, I couldn't bring myself to care. Life had moved on from me. And Sophie was just a distant memory. Life is a way of surprising you when you least expect it. After the storm of betrayal, divorce, and heartbreak, I never imagined that happiness would find me again, but it did, in the form of Brianna, a woman whose love was as deep as her kindness. Meeting her was like finding the missing piece of my soul. And together we built a life that was not only stable but truly fulfilling. I remember our first meeting vividly. It was at a charity event. One of those awkward situations where I had been dragged by a colleague. I wasn't looking for anything serious, still carrying the weight of my past, but there she was, Brianna. Her smile was warm and genuine, not forced or distant, like Sophie's had become in the final years of our marriage. There was something about her that instantly put me at ease. Like I didn't have to pretend anymore. We started dating casually at first, but it quickly grew into something more. It wasn't just her beauty that drew me in, though. Brianna was striking in her own way. It was her compassion, her patience, and her sincerity. She was the kind of person who would go out of her way to help a stranger, the kind who saw the good in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. With Brianna, there were no games, no secrets, just love, plain and simple. After a year together, I proposed. It wasn't an elaborate gesture, like it had been with Sophie. No grand romantic setting or carefully rehearsed speech. We were sitting in our living room talking about the future, and the words just slipped out. Brianna, marry me. She blinked, surprised at first, then a smile broke across her face. Are you serious, Daniel? Dead serious. I said, looking into her eyes, knowing that this time I was ready for a real future, a future built on trust and love, not lies and betrayal. She laughed, throwing her arms around me. Yes, of course. I'll marry you. We were married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. Nothing extravagant. Just the people who mattered. As I stood at the altar, watching Brianna walk toward me, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was my second chance at happiness, and I wasn't going to let it slip away over the next few years. We built a life together. Brianna and I bought a house, a real home, not just a place to live. It was a modest suburban house, the kind with a backyard big enough for kids to run around in. We spent weekends planting flowers and repainting the kitchen. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours and it felt right. Then came the children. Was Lily, our little girl with her mother's blue eyes and an infectious laugh that could light up the entire room. Then 2 years later, we had Jake, a spitting image of me, but with his mother's gentle nature, they brought a joy into my life that I never thought possible. The sound of their footsteps running down the hall, the way Lily would curl up on my lap with her favorite book, the way Jake would call out Daddy every time I walked through the door, these moments became the center of my world. It was in the middle of this newfound bliss that I saw Sophie again. It happened by chance at the grocery store of all places. I was pushing the cart with Lily sitting in the front seat, happily babbling about some toys she wanted. Brianna was a few miles away looking for something. When I saw her, Sophie, she was standing by the frozen food section, staring into the glass as if it held the answers to all her problems. I almost didn't recognize her. The years had not been kind. Her once vibrant appearance, had withered away. Her skin was pale, her hair thin and unkempt. She looked older. Far older than her actual age, like life had beaten her down at every turn. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw the regret, the sorrow, the jealousy. It was written all over her face. She glanced at Lily, then at Brianna, who was walking back toward me, with a box of cereal. The realization of what she had lost was evident in her gaze. She had nothing now. No husband, no family, no home. Just the weight of her past mistakes dragging her down. Daniel, she whispered, her voice so soft. I almost didn't hear it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was the first time I'd heard her say those words since everything had fallen apart. Her voice cracked with desperation, but it didn't move me. I felt no pity, no anger, no lingering pain. I had moved on. The person standing in front of me was no longer the woman I had once loved. She was a ghost of the past, clinging to the wreckage of her own choices. I didn't stop to respond. I didn't even break stride. Lily tugged on my arm, asking about something else, and I smiled down at her. Let's go find mommy. I said, guiding the cart forward as we passed by Sophie. She stood frozen, her hand clutching the edge of her shopping basket, her eyes following us with a mix of longing and bitterness. It was as if she was watching the life she could have had slip away before her very eyes. But that life was mine now, and she had no place in it anymore. When we left the store, Brianna noticed something was off. Is everything okay? She asked, sliding her hand into mine. I squeezed her hand gently. Everything's perfect. I said, and I meant it. I had a loving wife, 2 beautiful children, and a future that was brighter than I had ever imagined. The past was just that, the past. We drove home that day. And as we pulled into the driveway, I watched Lily and Jake rush out of the car, racing toward the front door. Brianna turned to me, smiling. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. Sophie was gone from my life, a distant memory. She had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. Meanwhile, I had found true happiness, the kind that comes from real love and real commitment. I didn't need revenge anymore. My life was the ultimate proof that I had won. As I walked into my home with my family by my side, I knew one thing for certain. This was my new beginning, and it was better than anything I had ever dreamed. Sophie's decline wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. After the divorce and Connor's sudden departure, she was left with nothing but the weight of her own decisions. At first, she tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, convincing herself that things would turn around. She stayed in a cheap hotel for a while, living off what little saving she had, hoping that Connor would come back for her or that somehow I would take pity on her. But as the weeks turned into months, reality began to sink in. It was around that time that she reached out to me for the first time since the divorce was finalized. I'll never forget the desperation in her voice when she called Daniel. Please, can we talk? I sat in my office. The phone pressed to my ear. Listening to her falter through the silence on the other end, I could hear it in her voice, the regret, the fear. She was starting to realize what she had lost. I didn't respond right away, just letting her words hang in the air. Please. I need your help. I don't know what to do anymore. For a brief moment, I thought about the 15 years we had spent together, the holidays, the anniversaries, the promises. But all of that had been shattered in an instant. When I had walked in on her betrayal, I had spent months healing from the damage she and Connor had inflicted, building myself back up after being torn down. Now, here she was pleading for my help as if that betrayal had never happened. I'm sorry, Sophie. There's nothing left to talk about. I finally said, my voice calm, devoid of emotion. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. She tried again a few weeks later. This time in person. I was at the park with Brianna and the kids, pushing Jake on the swing while Lily giggled as she played with her mother. It was one of those peaceful afternoons that made me realize how lucky I was to have found real happiness. Then out of nowhere, Sophie appeared. She looked worn, her clothes slightly wrinkled, and there was a certain fragility in her step. As she walked toward me, I tensed for a moment, surprised to see her there. Rihanna was too far away to notice her approach, and I instinctively positioned myself in front of Jake's swing, blocking Sophie's path. Daniel, please. She started, her voice low and shaky. Just hear me out. I looked at her, barely recognizing the woman who had once been my wife. There's nothing to say, Sophie. I said, whatever it is you're looking for. I can't give it to you. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she glanced over at Brianna and the kids, her gaze lingering on them longer than I was comfortable with. I miss you. I miss us. Can't we at least talk? I don't have anyone left, Daniel. That's not my problem anymore. I replied, stepping away and turning back toward my family. I've moved on. You should too. As I walked back to Brianna and the kids, Sophie stood there for a moment watching us. Her face was a mixture of pain and longing, but I didn't feel a shred of pity. I had made peace with what had happened, and I had no intention of letting her back into my life. I had given her too many chances before, and each time she had only let me down. This time I wasn't going to make the same mistake. Those the last time I saw Sophie for a while, she tried reaching out through mutual friends, but no one wanted to get involved. Word had spread about what she had done, how she had betrayed me with Connor, how she had lost everything in the process. The people who had once been part of her life slowly distanced themselves. Unwilling to be associated with the mess she had created, Connor's departure only added to her misery. After the miscarriage and the violent argument that ended their brief affair, he had packed up and fled the country, leaving Sophie to deal with the fallout on her own. No one knew where he had gone, and quite frankly, no one cared. He had destroyed his career, his relationships, and his reputation. All for a fleeting moment of lust. Now, he was just another ghost disappearing into the wind, leaving nothing but destruction in his wake. Sophie, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces. She bounced between cheap apartments, scraping by on whatever she could find. She had no job, no support system, and no one to turn to. Her pregnancy, which she had once clung to as a twisted form of hope, was now a distant, painful memory. The miscarriage had left her broken, both physically and emotionally, and the loss of the child. Connor's child was a wound that never quite healed. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about her from mutual friends, how she was struggling. How she was barely getting by, but I never allowed myself to feel sorry for her. This was her doing. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. One night, years after the divorce, I received one final message from Sophie. It was short, just a few lines scrawled on a piece of paper, delivered to my office by someone I didn't know. I've lost everything. I'm sorry for everything. I never meant for it to end like this. I just want you to know that I regret it all every day. I read the note once, then crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. It didn't matter anymore. Whatever regrets Sophie had, they were hers to carry. I had no room in my life for her apologies. As for me, I thrived. My career flourished in Brianna, and I continued to build a life filled with love and laughter. Our kids grew up surrounded by a stable, happy home. And every day I was reminded of how far I had come since those dark days of betrayal. I had taken control of my life, exposed the truth, and watched as those who had wronged me crumbled under the weight of their own deceit. In the end, I won Sophie's life. On the other hand, was a slow, painful descent into obscurity. She became nothing more than a footnote in the story of my life. A cautionary tale about betrayal and its consequences. I didn't need to seek revenge. Life had taken care of that for me. She had lost everything. Her lover, her child, her home, and her dignity. And there was nothing left for her. But regret. I often wondered if she ever truly understood the gravity of what she had done. But in the end, it didn't matter. My life was full, and hers was empty. And that was the real fallout.